Good morning, everyone. The Lord be with you. I'm Rolf Nolasco, Ruben P. Joh, Professor of Spiritual Formation and Pastoral Theology here at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. Thank you for joining us today. G-Talk is a space for soulful conversation. It's about engaging in God talk in a manner that is personal, practical, embodied, and open-ended. And we hope that through this conversation, we will all get a glimpse of the myriad ways we experience the divine intersecting with our quotidian life. For our mindful exercise this morning, we will practice what it's called Visio Divina, or divine seeing, in which we prayerfully invite God to speak to our hearts as we look at an image. And we will use Andrei Rublev's icon of the Trinity for this exercise. Rublev's iconography of the Trinity is actually an interpretation of the story of Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 18. And as we collectively gaze upon this image on the screen, our eyes and our hearts are drawn or directed to see and to know God in God's triune presence. Their unity draws us out of our own fragmentation, both individually and collectively, to help us remember that amidst isolation and loneliness and absence, God is, God remains, and God is with us. And so I invite you all to explore the icon with your eyes and with your feelings. Pause and gently attend to those feelings bubbling up inside of you. Simply sit with it, mindfully and prayerfully looking at it, really seeing it. Now draw your attention to the Christ figure seated at the center of the icon. Notice the crimson and blue color of the garment and other details that catch your attention. When ready, turn your attention to the figure on the right, the God, the Creator figure, and notice the creation colors of blue and green, and just simply sit with it and let it speak to you. From there, turn your gaze to the figure on the left, the Holy Spirit figure, and notice the transparent color, and then ask the Spirit of God to guide you, to guide us during this prayerful meditation. Notice how the Christ figure sits at the right hand of the Creator God, who nods towards him. And the Son, in turn, inclines his head to the Holy Spirit. And attend to this circular visual moment and receive what this might symbolize for you. Lastly, draw your attention to what seems to be the Eucharistic table and the hand of the Christ figure making a welcoming gesture. That space that each one of us is inhabiting right now, that space from where we gaze upon the Trinity, that space right here at this moment has been and is reserved for us. The invitation is for us to take part in this intimate fellowship, this circle of unbroken union, just as we are. Now let's take a few deep breaths, noticing the air that's coming in and out of our body, letting our body breathe us into this wonderful connection we have with God, who is with us at this moment. Breathing in and breathing out. Breathing in and breathing out. And in our exhalation, simply utter the words, Emmanuel, God with us. Friends, we are very blessed to have this morning Dr. Wonhee Anne Joh, Professor of Theology and Culture and Director of our PhD program here at Garrett. An interdisciplinary theologian, Dr. Joh's research and scholarship focus on post and decolonialism, critical ethnic race and Asian American studies, feminists, queer and affect theories, and constructive theology. Her publications include Heart of the Cross, a post-colonial Christology, and she's the co-editor of Critical Theology Against U.S. Militarism in Asia, Decolonization and De-imperialization, and Feminist Practice Against U.S. Militarism. She's currently working on another book entitled Trauma, Affect, and Race, to be published by Fordham University Press. This morning, we will get to see another side of her and hear her converse with us on a topic that is deeply personal, yet universal at the same time. The experience of loneliness and the gift that may actually underlie or buried beneath it. Before we begin, please know that this conversation is not meant to valorize loneliness. We are acutely aware that loneliness in general is often correlated with depression, anxiety, and other physical effects. If our exchange is triggering for you, please step back, take a few deep breaths, and then perhaps reach out to someone. And this webinar is also going to be recorded, so you can always come back to it when you are ready. Dr. Anne Joh, I want to see you on the screen. I'm not seeing you right now.
Oh, so I just turned the video on. I was expecting something else. Anyway, thank you for having me here.
안녕하세요, Anne.
안녕하세요.
Thank you, thank you. 감사합니다. For those of us who are joining us remotely, we want this conversation to be interactive. And so we will have time at the end of the interview for question and answer. And we would like for you to drop all your questions in the chat box. And our very able PhD student, Myron Chris, will help moderate that conversation. So let's delve right into it, Anne. When did you feel, or when did you last feel lonely? And maybe before you answer that question, perhaps you can describe for us what that word means for you first, and then answer the last time you felt lonely.
I think for me, just one thing really brings on this feeling of loneliness, whereas otherwise, I think it conjures up the word alone, and it's not necessarily a bad thing in my book. I think most of my life, I've experienced being alone, right? As a first Korean woman to do this or that, or the first in the family to do this or that. So often, so I've had to learn to make way, out of no way for me. And, I was lucky enough to encounter mentors along the way who accompanied me and showed me some of the pitfalls or what lies ahead. But I think my sense of loneliness actually arises, especially as a single parent. So, other things, my other roles or what have you, I know what to expect, and I could work through those expectations, right? Like as a scholar or as an activist or what have you. But I think with parenting, you every day is like you're learning to be a new parent. And when they were young, it was different set of issues that would come up, and then when they're older, there's whole different sets. But I think I feel the most loneliness when my kids go through things that I don't have a manual for. And this also happened recently. When my kids were going through something last year, my older son, and then just recently my younger son, just navigation of life, and what did it look like? It would keep me up at night, right? So I'm alone as an adult, and it keeps me up at night because there's no manual. I search and Google online, for the best tips, but because your kids are also particular and specific, they require different kind of response, and only you can gauge the wisdom of your response. And so there's a lot of anxiety about that. So I'm often up at night feeling those anxieties, when they do come about. And those are the times when I wish there was another person who would understand, who also knows my kids, right? And who I could have a conversation about. But I think that's one of the things as a single parent that I feel so unprepared for. And so that brings up those moments of acute loneliness.
Thank you, Anne. What do you think? What's in single parenting that evokes this acute experience of loneliness, besides you're doing it on your own? That you're alone in parenting them, in talking to them, and walking alongside them during their difficult moments. But what is it about that relationship that creates this really very deep sense of, and what I'm hearing you say is not just loneliness, but isolation as well?
Right. So I think it's really interesting. I think I wouldn't want to say, single parenting is a particular dimension, sort of irregular, right? And that the regular parenting is when you have two hetero couples parenting, in those parenting roles. I think in those roles, one could also feel loneliness too. There's no guarantees, right? Just because you have structural legitimacy, quote unquote, and recognition. I think what brings on even more acute sense of loneliness as a single parent is knowing that you have through choice or as a default been now untethered from these structures of recognition that says that your relationships are somehow not normal. And so not only are you parenting alone, that brings on these moments of loneliness, but because there's a kind of a disrecognition of your grouping, your collective as these relationships, there's that social dimension that you're also navigating, because you want to not have your kids feel as if they lack some kind of social recognition, right? Which our culture just automatically brings on because it's sort of in the air. The heteropatriarchal marriage institutions are the dominant normative reference. And so it's like white supremacy, it's in the air that we breathe. And so you're sort of countering that too as you parent. And so there's an added dimension, you know.
And we're going to go back to that piece and about how the larger culture or the larger social ordering in society can actually engender loneliness. But I want to press the conversation a little bit and make it more tangible and personal for us. How could, you know, when you said that part of this experience of loneliness is anxiety, how have you experienced loneliness interiorly? And by that, I mean in your body, in your mind, and in your spirit or soul. How has that manifested concretely in you?
Sure, I think, you know, I remember one of the hardest or the most difficult time was when I was in Oklahoma and my older son was really facing this kind of outright racism and the rage he had against that, you know, because of his own experience. You know, as raising a boy, I didn't know that, I realized there was a limit to what I could do as a mother. And so you have all those things. And I remember this image of realizing there's not much I could do except not let go of his hand metaphorically. It was like we were caught in a storm in the ocean, and I couldn't, the only thing I could do was not relinquish and to let him know that I was there. But I think for me, you know, how did it manifest? I think you feel very weak, you know, you feel the vulnerability, you feel, you know, you need the might of another person, whether it's psychological or physical, right? And you don't have that. So I think that's, for me, it comes out that way. And anxiety is, I used to get panic attacks, right? Where I can't breathe. I have a hard time breathing. I feel like I'm suffocating literally. So I do a lot of walks, as you know, and I garden when I can. And then when the weather gets cold, I'm actually knitting, because these are all sort of physical things that I can do, you know. I remember the first time I had a panic attack, I thought I was going to die, and I went to a doctor, and he actually said, you know, physical exercise may help. And I thought, well, you know, I can't breathe already, so what do you mean physical exercise? And his thing was, you could actually work through that. So you know, part of me is really knowing that the panic attacks, my incapacity to breathe, can be helped through, you know, not only physical activity, but also a kind of mindfulness about breathing and breath work. So it's also when I started to go into a bit more of, you know, meditation at an introductory level, just to help myself to breathe.
So you mentioned that when you are engulfed by this feeling of loneliness, anxiety comes on for you, and that renders you vulnerable on so many levels. And that part of the coping that you have done to do, or part of the coping that you have done, is to do some physical exercise, gardening. I am curious about what psychological or spiritual resources have you leaned towards or found to be helpful to cope or even mitigate the experience of loneliness?
I think for me, you know, I mean, because my habit is to read, to figure out, right? So I started to read a lot on Buddhism and on suffering, and how they focus more on suffering in general rather than the Christian notion of sin, which actually helped me to understand and let go of my resentments that I may have toward others, right? For what they didn't come through for me or for my kids, or in society at large. And so it's a way of learning to let go. It's also a way of learning kind-heartedness in the everyday practice, not just to myself, but, you know, over the years, my parenting ways have changed, being informed by that, you know, and so I try to create a culture within our relationships where I am more than this sort of socially legible mother, and they are more than the socially legible sons in my life. And so that's really helped, so when they go through periods of anxiety, I know what they might be going through. And so it's asking the questions of what do you need, what can I do to support you so that some of that anxiety is, reduced. So I don't know if I answered your question for that.
Of course. This whole conversation is about the gift of loneliness, and it looks like in your ways of dealing with it, you have uncovered gifts that this very human experience brings. And so I wonder if you can brief with me the gift that that experience of loneliness, particularly in your context, brought in your life.
I think in a way, this keen awareness or capacity to see others with compassion. So I think that's what it's done, just expanded my capacity for seeing whatever is going on with other people, and no matter how they react to me or respond to me, is to practice kind-heartedness and generosity and compassion. And I actually, I think the gift is that my kids have, by osmosis, taken on this kind of posture to life. And I see that in the way they relate with their friends, right? And people around them, which I'm really proud of, because I think in some ways, given our culture that we live in, this sort of hyper globalist and capitalist world, that their way of being in the world is also quite revolutionary in the everyday, I think. So I think that's a real gift. It's hard to be kind-hearted or compassionate. We kind of sneeze at that these days, but I think it's very important.
And so the experience of loneliness for you, Anne, is it has expanded your level of empathy and kind-heartedness towards other people. That is
yes.
now became more palpable when you experience this very human dimension.
Right. And I mean, I really think that, nobody goes through life unscathed. So you never know, what is going on with the other. So that's just my practice, that one never knows. I think sometimes people see me and they think, oh, she has it all together. She's, I don't know. I think that they have this image, and it's nobody knows what you went through, right? And I would like to think that everyone has that journey too, that I'm not an exception. So,
I have been reading a lot of Thomas Merton, particularly when I got into the life of contemplation, and I want to read out a quote, and I'm interested to hear what you think about it. Thomas Merton, in one of his diaries, he realized that when he is with people, he's lonely. But when he is alone, this is what he said: I am no longer lonely, because then I have God and converse with God without words, without destruction or interference. Any thoughts on that piece? And I can resonate with this. Yeah. Go ahead.
I too resonate with this passage. And that's why I think in the beginning, I sort of put in the qualifier about alone, which I thoroughly, I'm at peace with being alone, right? And for me, when I garden or when I walk in the woods, these are moments of communion for me. I do not feel that I'm alone. I think there's a sense of being humbled by, creation. It's humbling to know that I'm part of that. And it's also very healing for me. Healing in the sense that, whatever transcendence there is, it manifests for me in nature. And it's in these moments that I feel at one with whatever spirit or power there is out there in the cosmos. So I totally recognize this quote and yeah.
Right, right. I mean, he said, I am no longer lonely,
Mhm.
right? Because it is in this experience of aloneness, but loneliness, that he was able then to experience the presence of God. And for me personally, I'm an introvert, and I've lived my life pretty much solitarily. But there have been times when I feel alone and lonely at the same time. But because of many years, I'm very old, I've learned to lean into that experience of loneliness a bit, not to run away from it, not to move against it, but just to kind of stay with it, hoping that I would receive something. And that something for me, for the longest time, has been this unspeakable, unnameable presence of God. That is an experience holding my mere fragmentation, my aloneness, and my loneliness. And I find that to be quite powerful. It's painful, it's hard, but when I just sit just a little bit with that feeling, often by the grace of God, I experience this sense of presence. And it sounds like you get that through nature.
Yes, for me, that is really through nature, whether I'm out hiking somewhere or, walking in the woods or even biking on my own or gardening. Just those, I know that, these are all beyond me, right?
Mhm.
They were here before me, they will be here after me.
Mhm.
And I think what it does is to recognize I'm part of something larger, beyond myself, beyond my immediate, beyond this life.
Mm.
In that regard, it's really humbling. And at the same time, there's a really deep sense of connection.
Mm.
And so I think, that is also, different kind of theological worldview.
Mhm. Mhm. Let's talk about the pandemic,
Mhm.
especially during lockdown, which has forced people to remain socially and physically distant, right? Impacting a variety of people in manifold ways. Whether they're alone or together, the feeling of loneliness became even more acute during those precarious times. My question for you, Anne, in your observation, what have you seen that persons or communities have done or are doing to fill that chasm of disconnection and loneliness? So we're approaching the pandemic not from a place of deficit, but from the place of strength, about how people and communities have dealt with the pandemic that created social psychological distancing. What in your observation, what have they done? What have we done to fill that chasm of disconnection and loneliness?
I think the most concrete one that I witnessed, and I think it was really interesting that people have this capacity, and it was very latent before the pandemic in many ways, especially for a lot of middle class folks, right? I think a lot of communities of color or communities that have been marginalized by, sort of this global capitalism and always precarious have lived this way of what many people call, this mutual aid,
Mm.
right? But mutual aid as a concept and as a practice begins to really emerge full force during the pandemic. I think a lot of people got onto it. It's, as simple as like offering. I noticed like in our neighborhood, we have a lot of people who are older aged, and we decided during the pandemic, like we would reach out to each other when we go grocery shopping and pick up groceries for others, right? And leave at the door so they wouldn't have to be out, about in the public. So that was like one kind of thing. But I also noticed just that overall, on a larger scale, lots of mutual aid organizations started to pop up, and people doing it formally and informally, which was wonderful. And I think, and I actually saw a book immediately come out by Dean Spade on mutual aid. And I thought, well, this is really interesting because this is something that we've always been doing, right? Single mothers have been doing this all the time, right? Communities of color have been doing this all the time. People who are on their own have been doing this, right? Women living on their own have been doing this. It's a kind of mutual protection in many ways, rather than sort of mutual competition. It's so I thought I saw the surge of this practice, which I think was a way of responding to the imposition that COVID-19 brought to many of our lives. We had to in order to live. So.
Right. And this is not at all trivializing the pain, the deaths that we've seen caused by COVID-19.
Right.
And as you know, the experience of this pandemic globally really has heightened the socioeconomic disparities and impacting communities of color more particularly. What do you think about this culture that we're living in? What is it about this space, this society, this nation, this culture that engenders loneliness?
I think, one thing that comes to mind right away is hyper individualism, or also hyper sort of, this like immediate nuclear family unit is the be all and end all. I think that kind of worldview for so long has really atomized people. And so our sociality is defined through separation rather than relationships and through connection with one another, regardless of kinship ties, right? And so I think for me, not just the pandemic, but when I was, single parenting and what have you, I'm acutely aware of the absence of, or the lack of, or the reduction of communal and the collective. It's often, my individual well-being. And we don't realize that our well-being is actually really connected with whether or not we are part of a communal and collective sensibility, right? And so I basically, I cannot survive this planet without the other. But we think, we could actually survive on our own. So.
I'm going to ask you to say a few things about how our students here at Garrett, we've got international students, right, who have decided to leave their communities, their families, to venture into the academic world and landed themselves here at Garrett. And because of the pandemic, there is this heightened sense of loneliness and aloneness even, right? Because we can't really be congregating as bodies. What would you encourage them to do? What would you say to our students here at Garrett who are right now experiencing loneliness in varying degrees? What would you say to them?
You mean to our international?
Yeah, to our students in general, but more so our international students who really are in such precarious situation at this time.
I think two things. One is your context is bigger than one institution, right? Which means your relationships, your the sociality that shape and form you and support you are beyond the walls of one institution, let's say beyond Garrett, right? And that you actually bring different worlds with you. And secondly, to protect and continue to cultivate and nurture those friendships, right? Conviviality all take effort and work. They don't just happen and blossom up. It's like you have to tend to it, right? And so I would say if you're able to meet via Zoom or meet for coffee, meet for walks, listen to one another, I think those are important. And to know that your world, again, is beyond the dorm room, right? Or beyond the apartment. So I think those are really good to keep in mind and keep a perspective, right? That the connections that you have brought with you are to be continued to nurture. You haven't left them somewhere and locked it away. They're actually still with you.
So part of what we would like to see happen even in ourselves is to reach out to people.
To reach out, yes.
To trusted people, hopefully, too, right?
Pardon?
Trusted people, especially.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, we're the most connected digitally. And I think during the pandemic, we relied so much on technology to reach out to other people, to connect with them, to experience a semblance of community. But we are also the most disconnected communities and individuals. How do you account for that paradox? We are the most connected digitally, at least in this part of the world, and yet we are also the most lonely, disconnected, and isolated. How do you account for that paradox?
I have nothing against being connected online. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I feel so privileged. I actually got to stay home and be connected through Zoom. It sort of fed into my the introvert side, right? So that was good. I think what happens with completely being online sometimes, and we see the cumulative effect of this almost 2 years, and why we want to be in person is that, when bodies come together, there are things that the online Zoom cannot pick up, and these are the energies that flow between the bodies, right? It's in the scent, it's in the side glance, it's in the capacity to sidle up to another person, right? So I think the physicality of bodies coming together really adds a dimension that you aren't going to get online, no matter how much of a sort of an intimate atmosphere you want to create online. And so, being able to worship, for example, in our chapel, that is very different experience than being able to worship online, because you're in proximity to real flesh and blood. And I might sound like I'm overprivileging the flesh and blood of the body,
No,
but for
that's
me,
important.
I think it's an important critical dimension.
I'm curious to talk to you about the fact that there's so many of us, and this is a follow-up question to your answer. Why do you think we are resorting to digitality as a stand-in for real and bodily community? You mentioned something about when we congregate, hopefully with social distancing in place, so we protect one another, that something happens psychically and bodily with other people. But why do you think, because there is so much access, we have so much access to digitality, why do you think people are resorting to that medium as a stand-in for real and bodily community?
It's interesting. I think it's a process of screening. The word screen and screening has interesting plays, right? And I think when we resort to it, it provides a screen. It provides a protective measure. It looks transparent, for example, but it's like a glass wall, right? Glass digital wall that still screens out and screens in particulars. So I think for me, it adds a kind of invulnerable space in many ways, because nobody wants to be that vulnerable. Bodies together creates a potential and potentiality for vulnerability, right? That screening does not. So I think it allows some of that. It allows a kind of different kind of protective measures for the, because, and we were not formed through processes and practice that encouraged becoming vulnerable. And so it's a way in which we could hide behind the screen.
Right. And part of the culture's not necessarily mandate, but they encourage vulnerability as something that you do in privacy, that somehow it's a weakness as opposed to a source of strength. That vulnerability can actually create community, but you don't have to behind the screen.
Right, but it's also really interesting, right? Because we can't presume that everyone has access to online or to being the digital media in the same way as everyone else, right? Some people are just on the end of receiving information dump, right? So it's not a mutual engagement. Let's say a Zoom space might have some kind of a mutual engagement. And it really goes back to doing the early stage of pandemic, right? In many ways, like who are the people who had access to being online, to working online, right? And who are the people who had to be like shelving those grocery stores for us, right? And was exposed to different kind of vulnerability and absence of protection. So I think, you know, we have to really look at those different dimensions of precarity for us.
Well, if anything, this situation really is inviting us to reconsider, reimagine what it means to be in community with one another, isn't it? Because the way we've done community before, I don't think it's actually adequate for the kind of needs we have as individuals, as communities as well. So this is really challenging us to rethink and to reimagine what it means to be human beings, but also what it means to be persons in community.
Right.
I'm going to invite Myra and Chris because I know that there are questions that our friends listening in that they want to ask us. Myra and Chris.
Greetings, I am Myron Chris. I'm a fourth-year pastoral theology PhD student and also interim pastor for Wellspring Community Church. I'm your moderator for today. We invite you to now write your questions in the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen. We have one question currently, but we invite you to ask some more questions. Put those in the chat now. First question is, tell us more about your practice of mindfulness. How did you receive training, one-on-one with a practitioner or counselor, therapist, psychologist in a group, independent of your own with books and or videos? How did you tell us about your practice of mindfulness?
So I am not a purist in any sense. So my entry into this was actually a hodgepodge of everything of the above. So I had a really good therapist, a clinician that I worked with. I also read a lot, like I mentioned before, and I also even like downloaded apps. I actually reached out to a friend who is a Buddhist practitioner and certified teacher in mindfulness meditation, and I asked her to tell me what's the best apps out there that I can use, right? Because the first time I had the panic attack, for example, I was really desperate to learn, and so I would like whip out the app sometimes sitting in a car in a parking lot, right? When I sensed this attack was coming on for the 5-minute breathing exercises. I also actually went into Lighthouse Yoga in Evanston and said, I need you to teach me the technique of breath work. So I did that as well. So it was, I was all about self-help, trying to figure out and learning, these days I do just, just very simple breathing exercise when I sense something coming on, just to help center myself. But I also will have, I listen to a lot of particularly Tibetan Buddhist on audio books on Audible, and I have them on because it just kind of reminds me so that I don't forget this sort of way of being in my everyday practice.
Thank you.
If
Dr. Velasco,
if I can answer that question too, Myron, Chris, I came to the whole mindfulness practice when I started reading Thomas Merton. He was very instrumental in my second conversion. And I encountered Thomas Merton at the retreat. And that was such a transformative experience for me. And so when I started writing the book, The Contemplative Counselor, that is when I really dug in and practiced and studied. And just like Dr. Joh, I listened, I practiced some more. I do it in my classes, mostly for myself, so I can be grounded in situations like that. But there is one thing that I actually do, which I haven't been able to do because of the pandemic, is to go to a monastery. That is heaven for me. That is where I get to experience solitude. And again, solitude is different from being alone. Solitude is this intentionality that you have to be alone. That has been such a gift to be able to be surrounded by people who work and pray, and then you return to earth. You return back to your life, and real life kicks in, and so I have to intentionally create pockets here and there just for me to breathe simply and gently and intentionally. So that's been my introduction to, and I think, a forever student of contemplation and mindfulness.
Thank you. We've also been talking a lot about how technology and everything that's going on with that. And I'm thinking about single folks. I believe all of us on the screen are single. I'm not 100% sure. But how do we challenge those notions of loneliness when we see everybody getting booed up, getting married, getting engaged, and you're still alone, can't find a man, and you're just there by yourself and crying yourself to sleep at night? What advice would you give to that person? What would you say? How do you reframe loneliness in the midst of that difficult situation?
I'm interested to hear your response to that, to my request, but Dr. Joh, do you have any thoughts on that? I've got some, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that, being partnered for many years and then now being a fabulous single person.
I love being on my own now. I have to say that, being with someone, I think friendships are really important, and they don't have to happen through these sort of, again, structurally legitimatized relations that are sanctioned, right? I think general friendships could do so much. I don't think I would have made it through some of the most difficult times in my life without being blessed by friends who spoke truth, friends who didn't speak truth, but it was to support me, right? They would badmouth the other person unabashedly, and what have you. So these friends were lifelines. And so I think rather than, finding a partner that's the end goal, I think nourishing and nurturing friendships last so much longer sometimes. Now, if you could find the two in one, that's wonderful. That's probably the end goal, right? But I also want to share, like, for example, and I'm sure my son might feel very ambivalent about this, but the other day, I was thinking, I haven't, like, the physicality of being partnered, right? The body next to you that could be comforting. That was really interesting, right? I'm thinking, wow, I'm alone in that regard, and I thought, well, how can I change this? And then I was thinking about myself, and then I also realized that my son, who's 28, that he's not partnered, right? And the kind of masculinity that he's also part of, I mean, he tries, but he's, the world around us, that kind of masculinity is not like touchy-feely. And so I just decided, for all of our sakes, that we're going to actually practice hugging a lot. So, and I said, okay, I'm going to hug you. So I would, like, give him a big hug. And the first time that happened, some months ago, he actually said, why? And I said, because I realized you haven't been touched by another human being. And so I'm going to give you a hug. I know you're a grown man, but I'm going to give you a hug as a son, and so I think friendships could do that, right? And the kinds of emotional care that friendships provide are really interesting, different kind of a caress, right? Those kinds of generosities. And so again, I would say to all the single folks out there, be fabulous and also cultivate your friendships.
Right. I mean, I know that too well. I think part of what I've learned is to just accept that loneliness is part of human existence, right? It's just part of who we are. And when we experience that, it really heightens our desire to reach out, to be in relationship.
But
okay, so this may be too much information, but I have been celibate for like 50 years. right? And I'm still fabulous, I think. And I know that it's not for a lot of people but that has been such a source of gift for me. But that doesn't negate the fact that I've experienced or long to be in relationships too, to have somebody next to me, right? But it hasn't happened yet, and that's okay. And the fact that I've been through this unpartnered is both a blessing and sometimes in lonely moments really hard to get through. But I think if there's one thing that we need to do maybe as part of the Garrett community is to celebrate our single people, right? I think the culture is so focused on being married, and you know what that means in terms of capitalism and neoliberalism. But I think in our churches, in our communities here at Garrett, we need to celebrate single people, that they are legitimate sites of wisdom and knowledge and just humanity in a way that that married partner people maybe don't get to see a lot of or benefit from. But I say celebrate single people. Go ahead, Anne.
Oh, I just want to add also that, you know, the one time I was really interested, right? And I looked at our faculty list, and I think like half of our faculty are actually single too. So just FYI. And the other thing too is I want to say that, you know, the French feminist philosopher Louise Irigaray talks about this, the problem of the two. And that is when you become coupled up, whole worlds are become close to you, right? And so you actually lose out on friendships because you're so focused on this one individual singular person that make the couple, that somehow you're not complete unless you're in a couplehood. And that couplehood has a way in which the structure of it shuts out so many other relationships. So I think, you know, most often when you're in a marriage, let's say, you know, a heteropatriarchal marriage, the culture is that it's so emphasized on gazing at that one individual that you lose out on friendships. I know in my case, I did not cultivate friendships when I was married because I didn't think that was my primary end, right? My primary end was sustaining and maintaining a relationship with this one other person. And it really delimited. And it was very much foreclosing so many other potentials, rich relationships. And so I lost out. And you know, right now I'm all about protecting friendships, cultivating friendships, because to me, it brings so many different worlds and wisdoms into my life.
What about you, Myron? You're not off the hook here. How have you dealt with being single and fabulous?
Well, I will keep the focus on you and Dr. Joh for right now. So ask me offline because we have so many questions. We only have a few minutes of time. But I do want to lift up two questions, and then you could just answer it if you are able to. It says, Dr. Joh, can you speak to the loneliness of young people who are digital natives during the pandemic? How do they maintain community and use social media? What challenges do they face with loneliness during the pandemic that differ than adults? So that's the first question. The second question is, Dr. Joh, you say that Buddhism has helped you with anxiety and loneliness. Why Buddhism and not any other? Can you provide a practical exercise?
So I think the quick question, because I really don't have much to say on this, is on the one on Buddhism. I for some reason, you know, I wasn't that drawn to contemplative traditions in the West. First, you know, I've had kind of like allergic reaction or suspicion about it. So I didn't gravitate towards that. I started to read Buddhism, and it just really felt like, I told someone it felt like spiritual homecoming for me. And so, you know, during the most acute traumatic time, I had Post-it sticky notes all over my house. And these were sort of these Buddhist mantras, right? And they were very simple, and yet just reoriented me to a different way of being in the world. And so that's why I gravitated. And somehow I think part of it is that I intuitively knew that my ancestors were more aligned with Buddhist teachings. like my grandparents and their parents. And so it totally made sense to me. And it was a kind of a homecoming. So that was my, very simple answer. The other thing about young people, I actually don't know how, I don't really have much to say about other people. So I could just share my observation with my son, who is younger, and who was a second-year college student when this happened. And, he moved back home. He's very digitally online. And I noticed that online became one way for him to stay connected with his friends, like he was playing video games a lot. And I asked, like, what is that about? And it was like all his friends being in that space playing video games, for example. When he graduated this past May, he says, I don't know what happened the last 2 years of my life. I feel like I didn't actually go to college. And he graduated, right? But it was 2 years of quarantining and living at home. It was very hard to, get around. All his friends had gone home as well. And so they were dispersed all over the world, right? And so I think for him, being online was a way of being connected with his friends. I kind of saw in him a loss of structure of time, for example. He really didn't go outside much. I mean, now I think he goes to the gym just to do what he can, but everything was very limited. And there was that deep sense of, it wasn't exactly despair, because I think they are much more attuned to digital world. But there was still a sense of, oh, I'm forever in this pandemic. This pandemic is sort of ongoing. I don't know what it's like to not be home anymore. So I do see that, and I feel really bad, because it's not as if like the world was in such great shape before the pandemic for that generation. They know like the world is on fire, it's going down the tube. And so there was that overall sense of despair in the air, I think. On the other hand, I'm also really amazed that they actually check in with each other on their mental health. That is like a big thing with, at least with my son. He was very active in school with mental health conferences and organizings and all that. And so really checking in on each other was a big thing. So it's a very general response, but I want to be specific by anchoring in, one person that I knew was doing that.
Well, thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Joh, Dr. Nolasco, as well as everyone that submitted your questions. We didn't get a chance to get to all of them, but hopefully you were enriched by this discussion. So for the sake of time, I will now turn it back over to Dr. Nolasco.
Thank you, Myra and Chris, for facilitating that conversation. Thank you, Dr. Joh, for being so vulnerable and candid about your experience of loneliness. I'm sure that your story, as much as it is uniquely yours, is ours as well, as there are aspects of it that I'm sure we can resonate with. Again, Anne, kamsahamnida, Sambe. Thank you so much. Thank you. Our next G Talk will be about queer spiritualities. Yes, you heard it right, friends. It will be about queer life as spiritual life. And for our November G Talk, we will showcase Garrett students who will explore with us questions like, what does spirituality have to do with being queer? How might queer life, queer notions of the spiritual? What kinds of spiritualities or spiritual practices do queer folks consider life nourishing through art, queer stories, and just being queer? This and more on November 10 from 11 to noon. Thanks again, friends, for joining us this morning. For those who missed our G Talk today, a recording of the conversation will be made available on the Job Institute homepage later this week or next week. I would like to thank my mom, who's been a source of many hugs for me, who's also watching from Canada. Friends, by the grace of God, may we all be awakened to the presence of God in the ordinariness of our lives. Right now, right here, at this very moment, Emmanuel, God with us. Be safe, be blessed. Until next time, peace out.